But anyway, this is what I do as a full-time faith ministry. I've been taking this ministry around the country and overseas for the last 8 years. And I speak at churches, Christian schools, and I do a lot of homeschooling conferences as well. Okay? So we're going to talk about the fossil record this evening, the fossils. And I see there's a couple of kids here. I just want the kids to realize that when we talk about fossils, we're not talking about your grandparents, all right? Just want you to know that, all right? But the fossils. And we're going to talk about something called the geologic column. The geologic column. Now, I'm going to use some terms like geologic column and the geologic ages and so on I'll talk about, but listen, these are simple concepts, they're not hard to understand, and I'll explain exactly what they are so you'll have these things very clearly in mind. The geologic column is like the Grand Canyon. Most of you have either been to or you at least have seen pictures of the Grand Canyon, right? Or if you've ever traveled someplace where they've cut part of a mountain or a big hill, they've blown it away to build a road system. When you look at the Grand Canyon or you look at that part of the hill or mountain that's been blown away, what do you see? Layers. Layers, right? Layer upon layer upon layer of what's called sedimentary rock. What is sedimentary rock? It's important for us to know what sedimentary rock is. Sedimentary rock is rock that has been formed by water processes. Water has actually laid down those layers of silt, sand, gravel, minerals, and so on. And what is sedimentary rock in the beginning? When those layers are first put down there, you know what they are? Sediment. That's why it's called sedimentary rock. Now, what I'm trying to get across to you is this. What is sediment? Sediment is not rock, folks. Sediment is basically mud, right? Mud. Soft, malleable mud. Now, that's important, and you'll understand why I'm making a point of it in just a few moments as we go along. But this is where we find 99.9% of all the fossils. They're found in these sedimentary layers, all right? And the geologic column is a gigantic fossil graveyard. It averages, now listen, it averages about 1 mile in depth. This is going to be important, so keep that number in mind. How thick is it? About 1 mile. It contains probably hundreds of billions of dead fossil remains sitting on the basement of the Earth's lower crust. Now, as we talked about this morning, I mentioned this morning in our discussion, our brief discussion of this subject, that what we call Darwinian biological evolution is pretty much based on the development of geological evolution first, okay? And basically what happened, Sir Charles Lyell, L-Y-E-L-L, that I mentioned earlier today, they came up with this whole structure of 12 geologic ages. They say that there were 12 distinct ages. You've heard of the geologic ages, the Cambrian and Precambrian and Ordovician and so on, okay? Well, if you haven't, now you get to hear about them tonight. But anyway, as I mentioned earlier, according to evolution, the lower you go, the older the layer. And so down at the bottom, in the oldest layer, evolution says that you find the simplest organisms, one-celled amoeba and bacteria. And as you go up the column towards the top to the more recent strata, the more complex the life forms become. That you actually see a gradation of invertebrates becoming fish, fish becoming amphibians, amphibians becoming reptiles, reptiles becoming birds and mammals, and eventually man. So all of that is based on this structure of geological evolution. All right? Now, evolution says that the geologic column represents the Earth's 4.6 billion years of Earth history. Now, folks, have you ever wondered why every time an evolutionist opens their mouth, out pops millions and billions of years? You ever wondered about that? Well, it's because for evolution to be possible, to even seriously consider evolution as a viable system, you have to be talking about millions and billions of years. When you're talking about the cosmological evolution of the universe, the formation of stars and planets and galaxies from nothing more than cosmic dust and gas, it's going to take billions and billions and billions of years. When you're talking about starting with one-celled organisms and winding up with man and going through all those intermediate stages to reach man, obviously it's going to take billions of years. So that's why they always talk and couch things in terms of billions of years. Evolution says that you find simple organisms, I'm talking about in the fossil record. According to evolution, we find simple organisms evolving or changing into more complex organisms, a gradual transition from one species to the next to the next. How many of you remember us talking about some of these things earlier today? Do you remember our discussion of this? Okay. Now, you might say, well, Bob, isn't it true that we find these areas called the geologic column with all these fossils scattered, around the globe? Yes, that's true. You say, well, if evolution is not the explanation for it, what is? Well, folks, it's very simple. As I mentioned earlier today, there was a worldwide catastrophic flood, according to the Bible, that occurred about 4,400 years ago. And not only does this flood, this universal flood, explain the formation of the fossils, the fossil record, the geologic column, it also explains all of the other incredible geological formations that we find on our planet. Those of you who have traveled at all, you know that there are some unbelievable structures, geological structures on this planet. You've got tremendous mountain ranges that have formed. Those mountain ranges have formed. Canyons have been cut out. Badlands, scablands, ocean trenches, mid-oceanic ridges, etc., etc. Okay? The explanation for these things is the flood. Now, the Bible tells us in 2 Peter 3, 5, and 6, for example, it says, "For this they willingly are ignorant of, that by the word of God the heavens were of old, and the earth standing out of the water and in the water, whereby the earth," called the world here, "as it existed at that time, being flooded, overflowed with water, perished," was destroyed. Now, I'm going to take an extra couple of moments here to explain what happened. And when you understand from the Bible, and the Bible does not go into detail, doesn't go into any kind of a detail about it, but there are two things that the Bible reveals to us in terms of the flood, that when you put these things into perspective, it gives us a very, very clear understanding of why the earth looks the way it does today, why we have such a tremendous record in terms of the fossils, and so on. Two things. Number one, there was a 40-day torrential downpour of water. That's what most people think of when they think of the flood. They think 40 days raining day and night, 40 days. It didn't just rain. It wasn't just some kind of a pitter-patter rain. It was a torrential downpour for 40 days and 40 nights. Folks, you cannot imagine how much water we're talking about just in this flood scenario. But I'm going to give you an idea. If we could somehow precipitate all the cloud systems that exist around the earth at one time, all the clouds right now around the globe, make them all start raining right now, you wouldn't have nearly enough water, even with all the cloud systems, you wouldn't have nearly enough water to sustain a 40-day torrential downpour. In fact, you wouldn't even come up with 2 inches of water worldwide. You say, well, Bob, where'd all the water come from to sustain that torrential downpour? Well, coming up next, we're going to talk about the dinosaurs and the pre-flood world. And one of the things I'm going to mention to you is the pre-flood environment in terms of that water canopy. In Genesis chapter 1, verses 6 through 8, it tells us that there was a water canopy, a vapor-type canopy that encased the earth prior to the flood. And we're going to see the effects of that on the environment on the earth. But what I'm trying to say to you right now, the water that used to be up there in that water canopy, it's now on the earth. That's where the rainwater came from to sustain that 40-day torrential downpour. Now, we have seen on television the last 4, 5, 6 years in this country the effects of these little local floods. I say little local floods, I mean they've been devastating, right? And if you've ever been involved in a flood, I mean, it's unbelievable. A little local flood can move boulders the size of this building like they're pebbles, like nothing. The power, the raw power of flood water is absolutely unbelievable. All right, so you've got that. Plus, what else does the Bible say happened at the time of the flood? Well, with all that rainwater coming down, something else happened in the ground. What does the Bible say? Huh? No, I'm talking about something that happened at exactly the same time that the rain was coming down. It talks about something else. The great fountains of the deep burst open. That's what it says. The great fountains of the deep. Listen, the average person, that is not going to compute. You know, you'll read it, you say, oh, the great fountains of the deep burst open. Okay, so what? Well, folks, what we're talking about here, geologically speaking, we're talking about tremendous reservoirs of subterranean water under the crust of the earth that would have been erupting through the crust of the earth. What does that mean? Well, we're talking about volcanic eruptions, earthquake activities of a major magnitude, shifting magmas. What I'm talking about, tremendous, unimaginable geological upheavals that would have been occurring during this same period. So just taking those two things together, just the floodwaters themselves and the great fountains of the deep bursting open, it is easy to understand why the earth looks the way it does today and to explain it in terms of the flood geology, okay? On the other hand, to try and explain the formation of mountains and canyons and badlands and ocean trenches and all those sort of things in terms of long, slow, gradual processes as per evolution is absolutely ludicrous. It's just idiotic to even try and take that position, okay? Now, here are some of the problems that you run into if you're an evolutionist. Now, I'm going to put a few things up on the board to just get my point across, but these are things that if you are an evolutionist, you have no explanation for these things. These things cannot exist if evolution's true. The first thing up there, if you can't read it, says missing ages. Now, folks, it's very simple. Here's the point. If evolution were true, and it talks about these 12 geologic ages, listen, if you were to find on this planet, anywhere, all 12 ages together in one spot, that area would be over 100 miles thick with all 12 ages. 100 miles thick. How thick is the column when you find it? 1 mile thick. Now, again, you don't have to be a rocket scientist to see it's supposed to be 100 miles thick. It's only 1 mile thick. Something's wrong, right? And it's called missing ages. There's nowhere that you find anything close to all 12 ages together, yet if evolution were true, anytime you find the geologic column, all 12 ages would have to be there. You can't have millions and billions of years just vanish, see? It'll become even more clear as we work our way through this. Reversed ages. Again, you're looking at the Grand Canyon, for example, and over half of the ages are missing. Maybe 3 billion years of Earth history, based on your chronology, is missing. And the ages that are actually there, the ones that you recognize, they're not where they're supposed to be. They're out of order. You have reversed ages, folks, reversed ages, older formations sitting on top of younger formations. How can that be? Well, that's the whole point. That can't be. That's impossible if evolution were true. You find human artifacts, pottery, tools, jewelry, in coal deposits. Coal deposits that, according to evolution, predate man by millions of years. Well, how is that possible? It's not possible. That's the whole point. Human and dinosaur tracks together. We're going to talk about dinosaurs coming up next, so I don't want to say too much about it. But folks, there's no question that man and dinosaur lived at the same time. See, evolution says that dinosaurs died out 63 million years before man came along. That's nonsense. There's no question that they lived at the same time. And we'll find that out when we get into the dinosaur message. Trilobites, polystrate fossils. Let's look at polystrate fossils for a moment. Polystrate fossils are fossils that run vertically through many layers of rock. Okay? Now, there's all kinds of different plant and animal remains that are polystrate fossils. I'm going to use tree trunks because it makes the best illustration. And you often find these. These are not exceptions. You find them all over the place. Now, there's two points I want to make here in regards to polystrate fossils. First of all, I want you to understand that according to evolution, see the green layer, see the blue layer underneath of it? You see the line that separates the blue from the green? According to evolution, there are millions of years between each layer of rock. Now, folks, I've had junior high students, 13, 14 years old, come up and say, well, that's nonsense. That doesn't make sense. They saw the problem with that. You see the problem with that? The problem is this, folks. What happens to a land surface if it lies exposed to the elements for even a short period of time, like 50 years, let alone millions of years? What happens to that land surface? It erodes, doesn't it? Erosional processes are going to work on that land surface. Can you imagine what those layers would look like if millions of years of erosion had worked on them? Do you think you're going to have nice smooth lines like we find? Of course not. Now, second thing, let's say from the top of that log to the bottom of that log, according to evolution, all those layers of sedimentary rock would make up 2 billion years of Earth history. That's one old tree, isn't it? You get it? See, what evolution is saying and what you must accept as an evolutionist, there's no way around it, that tree must have stood there for 2 billion years while those layers of rock were slowly forming around it. Anybody have a problem with that? Listen to me. The only way that you can have polystrate fossils, the only way that can happen is exactly what did happen. Now here we go. You remember when I started out talking about sedimentary rock? You remember that? Okay. All those layers of sediment, mud, were laid down one right on top of another continuously in a single event. Single event. They all happened at the same time. Anybody know what that single event might have been? A flood, of course. Again, folks, you know, there's only so much time we can spend on the subject, but see, most of this, as far as I'm concerned, is just common sense, just good old common sense. For example, there's no fossilization going on today to speak of, except in very, very rare instances. Do you follow me? What happens to an animal, for example, today if it dies? What's going to happen to that animal? One of two things. what? It's either going to rot or it's going to be eaten by other animals. Is it going to fossilize? No, of course not. Okay? Folks, to have what we call the fossil record, to have these hundreds of billions of dead fossil remains scattered around the globe, encased in these huge sedimentary deposits, it requires a universal flood scenario. When you're standing there looking at the Grand Canyon, God could not have given us a more clear, easy to understand, irrefutable evidence of the flood, the worldwide flood, than what He's given us. It's right there in front of you. Some evidences of a worldwide flood. All those deposits are water-laid sediment. Again, the geologic column itself, you couldn't ask for better evidence of the flood than that in itself. All water-laid sediment scattered around the globe. In other words, again, I want to make sure you understand exactly what I'm saying. I'm a Christian. I believe the Word of God. I believe completely and totally that there was a worldwide flood that destroyed the earth and all the land animals and people about 4,400 years ago. I believe that without reservation. Believing that, as I do, what would I expect to find as solid scientific evidence to support that? I would expect to find, as evidence of the flood, tremendous areas of sedimentary buildup containing hundreds of billions of dead fossil remains scattered all around the globe. So what do we find? Hundreds of billions of dead fossil remains scattered all around the globe in these huge areas of sedimentary buildup. That's exactly, what we find is exactly what we should find, okay? Marine fossils on mountaintops. Now, I don't know about you guys, but I was in the Army. We didn't make it to the top. The Navy didn't make it to the top. But those Marines made it to the top, and then they became fossilized. Marine fossils, listen to me. They have excavated, excavate means to dig up. They have dug up marine fossils on the tops of every major mountain range on this planet. I want to make a point. How many of you have ever flown in a commercial jet aircraft? Delta, American Airlines, whatever. Most of you, all of you, okay. How high do those commercial jets fly? Do you know? They average about 30,000 feet. They average about 30,000 feet. Have you ever looked out of a jet at 30,000 feet? Are you pretty far up there? Folks, the reason I'm asking you those questions is to tell you something. The Himalaya mountains are 29,000 feet up. I don't know what's going through your mind right now, but when I learned that, when I first found that out, I was stunned. I was absolutely just stunned to realize there are mountains as high as those jets fly. They have excavated marine fossils on the tops of the Himalaya mountains. It was on TV. They did a documentary, and it was one of the things they brought out. How do you think those little fishies got buried on the tops of those big old high mountains? Well, you see, about 4,400 years ago, there was a flood, just like the Bible says. Look at me and listen for just a second. What am I saying? What am I standing up here saying? What I'm saying is simply this. You can believe the Bible. That's what I'm saying. You can believe the Word of God. You can trust it. You can absolutely base your values, your beliefs, your priorities, everything on the Word of God. Flood traditions, virtually every ancient society of people that we know anything about at all. I'm talking about over 120 ancient cultures that we know about their past. They all believed in a worldwide flood that destroyed the earth and one family survived. If you know anything about anthropology, that is very, very strong evidence for the flood. A couple of things that deal with catastrophe, frozen mammoths, and fossil graveyards. we're talking about at least 5 million frozen mammoths that are buried in the permafrost area in northern Siberia, the frozen muck. Some of these mammoths have been excavated, that they still had their flesh on their bodies. The flesh had not decayed. They must have died and were buried and frozen so quickly that their flesh didn't have a chance to decompose. They have excavated a few of them that still had food in their mouths. They died and were buried and frozen so quickly they didn't have a chance to swallow their last mouthful of food. Try and explain that to me in terms of long, slow, gradual processes operating over eons of time, which is what evolution says, which is nonsense. Fossil graveyards, same way. Catastrophe, catastrophe. Evolution uses circular reasoning. Now, let's see. You probably would need to go to Tampa, and on Fowler, they have the Natural Science Museum. Anybody ever been to the Natural Science Museum? Most of you have been to a Natural Science Museum at some point. Let me tell you what happens. You go in there, and there's some person, usually with a PhD in some area of earth science, lecturing on the exhibits, and they're going to point to one of them. They're going to say, see that up there? See that? Millions of years ago. And they'll point to another one, and they say, oh, and see this one over here? Hundreds of millions of years ago. Do this next time. Say, hey, stop. Wait a minute, Bubba. But let me tell you something. People with PhDs do not like to be called Bubba. Just keep that in mind. So you say, just wait a minute, Bubba. Say, you've been throwing out these millions of years and so on, you know. You mentioned these things called trilobites a few moments ago, and you told all of us standing here that those trilobites had to be at least 230 million years old. I want to know how you know that. By chance, did you find the date engraved on it somewhere or something? And here's what they're going to say. He's going to say, or she, will say, well, we know that that trilobite's at least 230 million years old because we found it down here in this particular layer of rock. And anything that we find down in this layer of rock has to be at least 230 million years old. And you say something like, well, wait a minute. You may think I just fell off the old turnip truck, but I assure you I did not. How do you know that that layer of rock is 230 million years old? And do you know what they're going to tell you? Do you know what they're going to say? They're going to say, because we found a trilobite in it. You say, wait a minute. Wait a minute. You mean you're talking to the guy. You say, you're telling me that you date the layer of rock by the fossil, and then you turn right around and date that fossil by this layer of rock? You're dating them by each other? Is that what they do? Is that what they do? Yeah. That's exactly what they do. Is there any science involved? No. Not a bit. The whole chronology of the fossil record, folks, is just an arbitrary thing based on the assumption of evolution. Am I making this up? No. It's very easy for you to find out, to verify this. Very easy. Anyway, here's the issue, folks. Here's the issue. In regards of the fossil record, regarding the fossil record, here's what this is all about. If evolution is true, then it would be so well represented in the fossils that nobody could refute it, including myself. You follow me? See, you would have, look, by virtue of the way it operates, evolution, you should have a complete interconnectedness of everything from amoeba to man. you should see a very clear line of ascent there going from amoeba to man. And all of those transitional forms linking everything together. On the other hand, if the Bible is true, what would we expect to find in terms of the fossil record? If the Bible is true, we would expect to find nothing but fully developed life forms appearing suddenly. No transition, no intermediate creatures that are part lizard and part bird or part fish and part amphibian or anything like that. So what do we find? Well, we don't find anything but fully developed life forms appearing suddenly. No transitional forms, no intermediate creatures, none. You say, well, Bob, are you sure? I mean, is this really the way it is? Yes, of course it is, or I wouldn't be presenting it to you this way. But just to make my point so you understand just how blatant this situation is, if you study, well, let's just say right now, if you were enrolled in a program to get a degree in geology from any university, and I'm talking about, they're going to be teaching this from an evolutionary point of view, okay? And you're getting a degree in evolutionary geology, they will never mention the fossil record as an evidence for evolution, because they can't, because of what I've just shared with you. What they have now started teaching in the universities and graduate schools is the concept that's known as punctuated equilibrium. You ever heard of that? Anybody ever heard of punctuated equilibrium? It was developed by Stephen J. Gould, G-O-U-L-D, from Harvard University. Anybody ever heard of Dr. Gould from Harvard? A couple of you? Listen, all of you should know this name. Remember this name, because you know what? Dr. Gould is now America's #1 most prominent, well-known evolutionist. With the passing away of Sagan, with the passing away of Carl Sagan, how many of you remember Dr. Sagan? How many of you remember him? Raise your hands, the ones who remember Dr. Sagan. And he had his Cosmos series on TV and all that. Well, again, I think you'll find it interesting when I share this with you that Dr. Sagan he no longer believes in evolution. He has become a creationist. He's dead. He knows better. But anyway, so they're teaching punctuated equilibrium. What is it? Now listen to me. What is this punctuated equilibrium thing? What does it mean? What does it say? I'm going to quote it almost verbatim from the textbook. Here's what it says. Punctuated equilibrium. Since there is no record of evolution in the fossils. Did you hear that? They admit there's no hint of evolution in the fossil record. Then what must have happened, there was this, quote, quantum leap forward. Does that sound like good science to you? Huh? This quantum leap forward in the evolutionary process, and it happens so fast, there's no record of it. So, take our word for it, I guess. I don't think so. It's funny because, see, for years and years and years, they used to say that there's no evidence of evolution in the fossils because it happened so slowly. And now they're saying, no, we were wrong. There's no record of it because it was so fast. Which is it? And you know what? It's neither one, because both of them are nonsense. Okay? Very quickly, let me cover a couple of things. I want to say a couple of words about the cavemen. Because, you probably have some questions. You say, well, Bob, isn't there kind of strong evidence to say that we descended from apes? I mean, what about all these cavemen? What about Nebraska man, Neanderthal man, Cro-Magnon man, Piltdown man, Heidelberg man, Java man, Lucy? What about all these? There's a whole bunch of them, aren't there? Folks, I'm going to cover this very quickly. All of those so-called hominid creatures, caveman candidates, today will fall into one of three categories. And many of them have been reclassified into one of three categories. Okay? The first category is fully human, Homo sapien, no relationship to the simian, the ape family at all. I'll give you, for example, Cro-Magnon man and Neanderthal man, probably the two most well-known cavemen, right? Cro-Magnon, Neanderthal. It just so happens that both of them today, even your evolutionary anthropologists will tell you that if you were to take the remains, the skeletal remains of Cro-Magnon, Neanderthal, flesh them out, put flesh on them, put clothes on them, sit them down in this pew, nobody would even notice them. They look just like us. Here's the kicker. Both Cro-Magnon man and Neanderthal man had larger brains than we have, modern man, by over 12%. Larger brains. And folks, even though, yes, it's true, larger brain does not necessarily equate with higher intelligence, that's true, you certainly wouldn't expect your distant ancestors to have bigger brains than you have. Do you follow me? That's just nonsense. The second category is fully ape, no relationship to man at all. What are called the Ramapithecines and the Australopithecines, of which I'm going to use Lucy as my example, will fall into this category. Lucy is still regarded as the most likely missing link among your hardcore anthropologists that really cling to this evolutionary idea. And here's the story. Lucy, which was discovered by Dr. Johansen back in about 1973 in East Africa. Lucy is about 3 feet tall. And if I had with me right now a complete skeleton of Lucy, which there is not, and a complete skeleton of a pygmy chimpanzee, there's not one person in this room, including myself, that could tell them apart. Nobody can tell them apart. You say, well, wait a minute. How did this thing get into the textbook, and how come everybody well, not everybody, but how come all these anthropologists regard it as the missing link? Well, because Dr. Johansen says it is. That's basically why. And he bases, listen to me, he bases his assumption of Lucy being a hominid creature on the fact, he says that the pelvis bone, listen to me, you're going to find this outrageous, the pelvis bone and the knee bone show a propensity or an articulation of upright movement. Do you follow me? That this thing was starting to walk upright. Therefore, it must be one of our ancestors. Now, folks, listen to me. Number one, you can go out and find any number of evolutionary anthropologists that will disagree with his interpretation of that. I mean, it's just his interpretation. But forget that. But here's the good part. The pelvis bone and the knee bones that he used to make his case, those bones were found 4 miles away from Lucy a year later in a different strata of rock. Did you hear what I said? Those bones, am I making this up? No, this is easy to verify. It's all documented. Those bones were found over 4 miles away a year later in a different strata of rock. Is there any possibility that those bones could even belong to Lucy, what we call Lucy? No. More. I want to share this with you real quickly. How many of you remember Dick Cavett? Dick Cavett, the talk show host. Dick Cavett, right? Most of you? Dr. Johansen was being interviewed on national television by Dick Cavett. National television. Listen to what I'm saying. You can get a transcript of this interview. What I'm getting ready to tell you is public domain, folks. It was on national television. The reason I'm saying that is because what I'm going to tell you is going to sound so outlandish that you're going to have a tendency to think, Bob, you're making this up. And I'm not. I'm not making this up. In the interview, Dick Cavett looked at Dr. Johansen. Dick Cavett was holding what he thought was the skull of Lucy in his hand. And he said, Dr. Johansen, what are these two little dark spots here in the back of this skull? And Dr. Johansen, you could tell he didn't want to answer the question. He kind of hem-hawed around a little bit. And when he finally answered Dick Cavett, he said, well, those are the actual bone fragments that we found. Dick Cavett looked at him. He said, what? He said, what's the rest of the skull? What is this I'm holding in my hand? And Dr. Johansen said, well, that's a plaster of Paris reconstruction that we thought it might look like. And then we dyed that with chemicals to match the bone fragments. There's more. Later on in this same interview on national television, with everybody listening, Dick Cavett said, Dr. Johansen, how did you make the determination that these bones were 3.5 million years old? I mean, he just wanted to know how they come to that, maybe radiometric dating or whatever. Dr. Johansen said on national television, as we were flying into this area of Africa, they're up in the air, in the airplane. As we were flying into this area of Africa, we could tell that anything that we found down there would have to be at least 3 to 4 million years old. Folks, I'm telling you, and there's so many things I could tell you. See, you're talking about a category of people whose entire career can be made on the discovery of a bone fragment. These people can become filthy rich overnight if they come up with some kind of a missing link bone. You follow me? We're talking talk shows, we're talking books and magazine articles, we're talking being offered professorships at the most prestigious universities on the planet. We're talking about the approbation and esteem and envy of their colleagues, I think, which motivates a lot of them more than anything else. So with all that riding on it, is there any tendency, any temptation at all for them to fabricate the evidence to make it fit? It happens all the time. That's the third category, fraud. Fraud, hoaxes. And this area of science, anthropology, is rife. That means filled to the brim with hoaxes and fraud. All over the place. Java man exposed as a fraud. Piltdown man exposed as a big hoax. Nebraska man. Let me just camp there for a moment. We'll move on. Nebraska man. Some of you should remember Nebraska man because when you were in school, this was what was in the textbooks. Nebraska man was in the public school textbooks for over 45 years as the missing link. How many of you remember the Scopes monkey trial in Dayton, Tennessee? The Scopes monkey trial. The movie Inherit the Wind. William Jennings Bryan and Clarence Darrow was based on the Scopes monkey trial. The evidence that was cited in the Scopes monkey trial was Nebraska man. Hundreds of doctoral dissertations written on Nebraska man. With all of that, there must have been some really impressive evidence, right? A single tooth. A single tooth. Was it a human tooth? Somebody know? What was it? Does anybody know? It was a pig's tooth. It was later found to be a tooth from an extinct species of pig. Nebraska man. Folks, I'm just telling you that, again, it's over and over. See, this is all I've done for the last, many, many years of my life. I've been doing this full time for 8 years. And the more you delve into these areas, the more you understand about the different areas of science dealing with this subject, you are just left dumbfounded. Just dumbfounded at the dishonesty, the hypocrisy, and so on that you find among the science community today in their attempts to try and promote evolution regardless of the facts, in spite of the evidence, overwhelming evidence to refute it. Okay? Anyway, we're going to cover the dinosaurs in just a moment, so don't run off, all right? Just stay where you are.